What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. Today we're going to be taking 23 cards out and putting 23 cards in the Paradox Powers Precon on an extreme budget. I'd like to thank my patrons, especially you high contributing ones, Newsome you rock, and if you guys want to help me out and use that TCGplayer link in the description down below to pick up these cards, that would be amazing. Now let's get into this Deck Tech upgrade. The first thing we're going to do is choose our commanders, which is going to be the 13th Doctor. She's got a unique ability to untap our creatures that have counters on them, so we're definitely going to be abusing that. And then she also has the ability to put counters on our creatures. So now we're going to use Ryan to go ahead and buff him up with our commander, and then we swing in with Ryan, and then we start casting stuff for free off the top of our library. Then all we need to do is include cards that let us exile a bunch of stuff, even from our opponent's libraries. That way we can get him big as fast as possible. Plus, it's an excuse I can use to shove Paco and Haldan in another deck, which I absolutely love these two. The value you get off of them is insane, and it accumulates very quickly. So if this sounds like a Precon upgrade you want to get into, let's get into it. The first thing we're going to add is cards that synergize off of us casting stuff from exile, like my man Alf right here. He's just going to double up on whatever we're casting, which is going to be super solid. This badass Scorpion is exactly what we're looking for. Not only can it exile a creature card from our graveyard and then let us cast it for free, it's going to let us once per turn cast a creature for free from exile. So now we're not paying any mana for those giant bombs. Feldorn is just going to give us consistent value. We're going to be able to generate a board state with her, whether a land's entering the battlefield or we're casting something from exile. Additionally, we can discard our useless cards to impulse draw into something useful. Backgrounds are absolutely broken when you have two commanders because both of them will trigger off of the effect. So as long as we have our Doctor and our Doctor's Companion on the battlefield, whenever we cast a spell from exile, we're basically going to do double damage equal to its CMC to anybody's face. I can't stress enough, this card wins games. Moving on to the part of the strategy where we exile a ton of cards, that way we can trigger our commander as many times as possible. Nasari and Uvilda. Now we are just focusing on Nasari, that way we can exile a ton of cards from our opponents and cast them, making sure we can really start buffing our commander up, that way we can start casting spells for free from the top of our library. We're also going to throw in Mazio. Now this guy can be kind of risky because he has such low power, but remember our commander is buffing our creatures up. So as long as we have a solid attack for the first couple, as soon as we start casting some spells from exile, we can make sure this guy turns into a beefy boy and he can attack into everybody without having any issues. Speaking of beefy boys, we are running Paco and Haldan. I like this strategy because again, if you cast one, you can tutor up the other one, and then Paco just gets extremely beefy. He synergizes with our 1/1 counter strategy. He'll untap with our little creatures, be an amazing blocker, and give us access to a ton of cards to cast from exile. Deluxe Dragster. I bet our opponents are probably playing some pretty cool spells. Wouldn't it be cool if we could also play those pretty cool spells? From ramp spells to removal spells, anything they're using we now have access to. This is going to be extremely busted. Escape the Wilds not only ramps us, but it will give us a plethora of cards and options to cast from exile. Nira. Now remember, our commander doesn't just care about casting spells from exile, it just cares about us casting spells that aren't in our hand. So we can use Nira here to cast random spells and then basically cascade into a spell of the same type. It's very chaosy, but fits the theme of the deck perfectly in my opinion. I didn't dive too deep into the tapping and untapping shenanigans, but I think Arcanus could be pretty dope to run in this deck, as well as this sexy neck brace lady. Now we can just tap her and start taking control of our opponent's creatures, as if they weren't pissed off enough that we're stealing all of their cards. Leyline Immersion is going to also be super solid. I like running this in decks where our commander doesn't need to attack. Now obviously we have one commander that's getting in for damage, but the other one's just kind of sitting there putting counters on stuff. So she might as well be tapping for a ton of mana while she's doing that. Not to mention it does give us that ward ability, which will give her a little bit of protection. I wanted to give us more card draw options that would just flat refill our hand. We have Will of Misfortune, Windfall, and Rishkar's Expertise. I really like these options because again, these can take you from like an empty hand to a full hand out of nowhere. I also kind of just want this deck to ramp harder, so we're going to add Rampant Growth and Nature's Lore. We're also going to add Kodama's Reach and Skyshroud's Claim. Hardened Scales seems like a no-brainer, doubling up on those counters that we're putting on our creatures, and then we have Swiftfoot Boots to protect our important pieces because, again, our opponents are probably going to want to remove those. Moving on to the cuts, the first thing we're going to get rid of is the talismans, just because green ramp's going to be so much more efficient. If someone board wipes, those are gone forever, but lands are kind of more evergreen, so we're going to keep those around. Spiral Growth is also going to see a cut because it's just inconsistent. Sometimes you don't have a land and that second ability is just useless on the card. Carpet of Flowers, sometimes there's no blue player, so this does literally nothing. It's very good at competitive tables because a lot of people are playing blue usually at competitive tables, but in casual, it can be hit or miss, so we're going to cut it. Memory Worm does synergize with our strategy, but if we hit ourselves with it, we take 2 damage to loot, and if we hit our opponents with it, again, they get a loot, and 2 damage is not that impactful over the course of a game. These next 3 cards also got cut just because the bang for buck wasn't there, in my opinion. Again, they do synergize with our strategy, but we're not leaning too hard into artifacts. They all kind of create artifacts, and at the end of the day, I didn't think the abilities were worth it. Dan Lewis, I don't like this guy because he doesn't really synergize with the deck. Again, we're cutting a lot of the things that create a lot of artifacts, not to mention our number 1 goal is to make sure our creatures don't die because a lot of them have attack triggers. So buffing up their power and not their toughness is kind of a loss for me. River Song seems like a very cool commander, but this is also a very specific deck you want to play her in, right? You want something that synergizes with her and you want to build the whole deck around it, and it just doesn't synergize with this deck, so saw an easy cut. Build Pots also saw a cut for the same reason, right? Super cool commander if you build around it, but we're not building around that, so it's gone. Me the Immortal. Now this one probably takes a lot of building around for it to be worth it, so again, it was an easy cut. Strax saw the cut just because again, we're cutting a lot of the things that produce artifacts out of the deck, so just if it synergizes with artifacts, we're cutting it. The Fugitive Doctor, again, we're making more artifacts, and we're not really trying to do that with this deck, so we cut it. Lunar Hatchling is getting a cut for a couple reasons. One, we kind of want to utilize the cards in our graveyard, so if we have to exile them just to throw this onto the battlefield, it's kind of not getting us where we want to be. Additionally, if it is on the battlefield, it's a 6/6 with flying and trample. That's not going to get us there long term. Start the TARDIS and think twice saw cuts because 2 mana for cantrips, no matter what the other abilities are, I don't think that's really worth it. Truth or Consequences. While these cards are kind of interesting, I really think they're just going to take the life 9 times out of 10 when you really want to be drawing cards with this. So when your hand's empty and you cast this, 100% they're just going to dome themselves in the face and watch you do nothing. Psychic Paper seems pretty interesting when you're trying to do something with a specific strategy and a specific tribe, but here it's going to be an easy cut. Heaven Sent is kind of interesting, I'm not going to lie, and it does synergize with the commander, but I was thinking about it, 2 clues and then it deals 1 damage, and that's what it's going to do 90% of the time, and then you have to keep paying the 2 mana, and then the clues cost 2 mana to crack. It seems kind of like a huge mana sink that might not give us our bang for buck. Fugitive of Jadoon seems pretty good if we're trying to get a lot of doctors on the battlefield, but I think we're only running 2 in the deck right now, maybe 3, so it was an easy cut. Clara, now again, in the right deck, she's probably going to be broken, but in this deck, our doctor is putting a counter on something. So it's effectively a 6 mana hardened scales at this point, and then, you know, it's an easy cut from there. All right, guys, that's going to do it for the 3rd deck tech. I've got 1 more on the way. I've already done the other 2, so if you want to go check those out, by all means. I would also love to thank my patrons again. I couldn't do it without you guys. I appreciate every one of you, and as always, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors. I will see you in the next one.